Brought to you in association with Grendel Press. This is Werewolf the Podcast, a serial killer drama.
What? Oh, sorry. What is this? Podcast the Werewolf. No, Werewolf the Podcast. This is episode 198, okay? And we are with, let me just read this. We are with the professor on his journey to Cambridge. What? It says Cambridge. I'm not allowed to say Cambridge. I'm not. Anyway, his journey to a university town. And he's giving a talk about how magic works and what it does and stuff in that to a lot of students. So that sounds pretty cool. I'm going to give that a listen. Yeah, also, we'd like to thank Grendel Press. If you're choking for a good book, I wanted a good book on choking, but so I got one called Choking on the Deadlight by R.D. Nightshade. Yeah, so unfortunately, it didn't really have much choking in it, but that was okay though, because it was actually brilliant, and I really got into it. The hero Miriam, her mum dies, and then her mate Clara goes missing, and everything happens around it, and there's twists and plots and things. So there's not much physical choking. Don't look at me like that. I'm just. It is what it is. Yeah, sorry, I'm just getting stared at. But you know, I would recommend it. So that's Choking on the Deadlight, and you can get that from grendelpress.com. They have loads of really good books. So if you are a horror fan, go there and read stuff. Sorry, I don't know where that came from.
The Professor. The journey north was one of deep thought about what was happening in the Fey world. I'd plumped for an old favourite for the drive, an old-looking, much updated Hillman Minx. A glorious little vehicle. I found the Minx after quashing the Goblin Revolt in 1994 while working behind enemy lines. It was in a barn, in the middle of a contested farm. Quite a lucky find, actually. After we'd removed the vicious new leader of the Gobbos, I'd gone back and found it again and brought it for a song. Well, the farmer and his family were dead, so it was auctioned off. When I'd found it, it was a well-kept wreck beneath a tarpaulin. How she shone now with her burgundy paintwork. Every inch of its interior was exactly as it should have been, apart from the modern electrics hidden mostly below my seat. I wish I didn't need such things, but sadly I do. I found that I needed good music and a constant connection to the world. The classic Minx would have been a great escape from all of this, but I was a sinner, not allowed to escape from my duty. Or some abstract shit like that. But I didn't consider putting other modern items in the interior. Why do I need airbags? Why do I need seatbelts? It's not like I'm gonna die, is it? Not in a car crash, anyway. I eventually got to the city where I was being asked to speak that day. I can't tell you the city's name, I'm afraid. You know, I have to respect the Supernatural Secrets Act and all that. However, I can give you some clues. It has the most insane one-way system ever created by man. If it were not for my lack of evidence, I would say that the contraflow system of this great university town was designed by the devil herself. Although knowing her as I do, even she would not be so cruel. I'd put together an interesting lecture, and was to offer it and my so-called expertise to a group of doctorate students who were developing theories about things that I didn't understand, and didn't want to understand, to be utterly honest. One of those precious few was a world-renowned topologist. Now, I'd never heard that term in maths before, so, out of interest, I looked it up on Google. Topology studies shapes and objects where stretching, twisting, and bending doesn't change their fundamental characteristics, essentially allowing you to mathematically consider a coffee cup and a donut as ostensibly the same object. I tried to think about it for 10 minutes, then decided I was born to be ignorant of topology, so I left Google be and went back to check out one of my embarrassing vices. A few months ago, I found a website allowing you to read all the Dan Dare comics. I mean, all of them. It's worth a scramble on the World Wide Web if you don't know who he is. Dan Dare, I mean. You'll probably pick up a bit about the Mekong while you're there. Ugh. Where was I? Yes, the talk I was going to Cambridge for... Oh, shit! I didn't mean to say Cambridge. Oh, God, another reason to be sent to the Tower for treason. The talk was going to be titled Bridging the Gap Between Magic and Quantum Science. I started the music that I wished to listen to for the journey. I'd downloaded Django Reinhardt's discography to the car's media system. I found it downloadable somewhere. Obviously. Putting this music on quite fits with the lecture theme. I mean, if you want to talk about magic, in this case of the musical variety, I could squeeze a man's entire career of recorded music onto my phone. His discography was massive and had 25 years of recordings on it. 1928 to 1953. It made me smile that I had to go and explain magic to these students when it seemed an utterly incredible magic. All that information is on my phone. But where? Well, that's magic that's beyond me. In a small book-lined theatre, I started my talk. Gentlemen, ladies, not to mention others. I took a moment to gauge the reaction of those before me as I juggled words into the air to get the correct semantics floating before them. I would impress them with a juggling word flex. Others has many meanings. I fully respect all the others because that is my area of expertise. No, I don't mean I have any understanding of gender studies. I paused for some kindly offered smirks. Although I have learned much about that in my long and drawn-out time on this earth. I smiled before continuing. I include all others, as well as the many pronouns we have to engage with rightfully these days. I refer to those others on the fringes of science, magic, and truth. The others. I felt interest peak in the room. You find yourselves at the crossroads of science and legend, standing between the rigor of quantum mechanics and the whispered myths of the supernatural. I continued again, allowing a pause to elicit their interest. The following question is one that has haunted the greatest minds of both disciplines. Can magic be explained in quantum terms? And if so, does that mean magic is simply another form of physics, one we have yet to master? I asked. I looked around the dimly lit lecture hall, my gaze settling on the eager, if somewhat skeptical faces of the youngish students before me. They'd come from institutions across the world, physicists, mathematicians, and even the occasional theologian. Oh, and yes, the topologist, who was not what I expected. He was the opposite of the stereotype I'd built in my mind and looked like a battle-ready flanker from a late 70s rugby league team from Salford. He looked like he was smoking a Rollie, as we used to call those awful handmade cigarettes, even when he wasn't. Odd. Even odder, with all my years of working with these people, is that I still think in stereotypes. That really is utterly odd. I could sense that all the group were curious. I felt it. Let's see how they would feel after this little talk. They might come to the conclusion that I need some sort of mental health intervention. They might even be right. To understand this idea, we must first consider what quantum mechanics has already revealed about the nature of our universe. I continued. I wrote the next point on the whiteboard behind me. I'm not a fan of, the PowerPoint thing. It hurts my base sensibilities. I know I'm old-fashioned. Leave me to it, will you? Quantum superposition and the many worlds theory. I wrote in healthily sized letters. I wish we still had chalkboards. I much prefer them. After the squeaky blue scrawl had been written, I continued. We already know that at the smallest levels of reality, particles can exist in multiple states at once. A phenomenon we call superposition. I stood before them, checking their engagement as I tossed my marker pen from hand to hand, considering my next statement carefully. It is only when observed that they select or choose a definite state. Now imagine for a moment that a skilled practitioner of magic is merely someone who has learned how to guide this collapse of probability towards their desired outcome. A spell, then, is nothing more than a command for reality to take a certain path. I paused to let this concept settle in. Also, I'm always open to questions that need to be fielded. Nicely, though, it seemed that I could continue without that distraction. Similarly, the many worlds interpretation suggests that all possible realities exist at once. And yet, I stepped away from the lectern, still throwing and catching my pen whilst anticipating my next sentence with some difficulty. We only experience one world normality as humans. Magic could be the ability to step between these realities, borrowing knowledge, energy, or even entire objects from parallel timelines. The legends of oracles seeing the future, or wizards pulling swords from thin air, were perhaps merely bending probability in ways we simply don't understand. At least, not yet. A lot of typing and notes were taken by those before me. I stood and waited for them to finish what they were doing. There were no questions again, which was good, but slightly unsettling. Often I have to sort of reiterate these points. I smiled and cleaned the whiteboard with a sponge that was there for the precise reason of cleaning the board. I know this sounds strange, but these boards don't have these spongy things 9 times out of 10. Bloody useful, saves my kerchief. I genuinely think there's some supernatural power that makes them disappear. Maybe some whiteboard sponge fairy who steals them. Fairies are in my head again. Once clean, I wrote the next point. Quantum entanglement and magical bonds. Next, consider quantum entanglement, where 2 particles remain connected no matter how distant. I paused. Change one, and the other changes instantly. To the untrained eye, this might seem impossible. An action at a distance without any detectable link. And yet this is already proven physics. What then of telepathy, or the ancient idea of soulmates being connected across great distances? What of objects imbued with powerful emotion, cursed relics, sacred artifacts? If entanglement exists on the quantum level, why not on the human, emotional, or spiritual level? Perhaps our ancestors called it magic simply because they lacked the mathematics to describe it. I could sense brains being put in gear. Any questions at this stage? A number of heads shook in response. I smiled and turned back to the board. The bloody sponge had gone from its place. Was it the fairies? Oh no, silly me, it was on the lectern. I laughed and smiled with a little embarrassment as I made it obvious that I was returning for it, and I picked up the eraser with great deliberation before returning to the board to wipe the words away. The observer effect and the power of belief, I wrote. One of the strangest findings in quantum mechanics is the observer effect. The idea that merely observing something changes its outcome. What if belief is a form of observation? What if entire civilizations believing in the same gods, myths, and curses actually shape reality simply by focusing their collective will and belief upon it? Many ancient traditions speak of spells that require unwavering faith, of supernatural beings that exist only because enough people believe in them. Could consciousness itself be a key force in shaping the physical world? If so, then what we call magic is merely another expression of quantum mechanics, one we've yet to fully quantify. The topologist raised an arm that would have been comparable to the size of my leg and opened his palm to reveal a shovel-sized hand. Yes, David? I saw him look at me, shocked by the use of his name. I always made sure I learnt the names of those sitting in front of me and their backgrounds. Firstly, it's so lovely to use a person's name. They feel valued and respected. That I took some time to read their work and have a slight affinity for them. The second reason is helpful. It's that using their name makes them accountable. They can't hide in a crowd. The third and the most real reason that I learn names is that I'm actually a highly paranoid bastard, and I need to assess the safety of every situation. I absolutely hate being caught in traps. Always be ready for the worst.
Professor, is this point related to why ritual and pageantry is so important in magic? Why do we need all the candles, the chanting, the blood sacrifices? Why all that if it's just belief?
David asked. I smiled, leaning against the heavy oak lectern. An excellent question, David. One that cuts to the very heart of magic itself. I gestured towards the parchments behind me, where arcane symbols and Latin inscriptions were scrawled in my own distinctive hand. In my opinion, magic, real magic, is not a thing of nature that we've yet been able to isolate. It does not exist in and of itself in a manner that we can observe. I paused. This was such a bloody good question, and it had me thinking on the spot. A manner that we can observe effectively and in a quantifiable way. We can see the outcomes of magic, but not the process. Let me think. We can see the outcomes of the process, but not the process itself. That's where the magic is, I said, tapping my temple with a pen. Magic, my dear students, is belief. Human, conscious belief. A murmur passed through the room. I let it settle before continuing. Let me put it another way. You're all familiar with the placebo effect, yes? I received nodding heads and acknowledgements. The notion that a sugar pill given with enough conviction can actually cause healing. The same principle applies to magic, but on a grander and more terrifying scale. The universe doesn't care about your spells. It doesn't bend to whispered words alone. But you care. And the deeper you believe, the more reality begins to listen. It was flowing now. I'd never put this concept into words before, but I felt a journal paper would be this day's outcome. I was now becoming enthused and excited, and began pacing, hands moving as I spoke. This, you see, this is why ritual is so crucial. Every step, every motion, every carefully selected ingredient. These things, they reinforce belief and turn it into something utterly tangible. I stopped pacing. A spell cast in haste with no preparation is merely a wish upon the wind. But a spell woven through hours of ritual, with chants memorized, symbols drawn with steady hands, blood or bone offered as sacrifice. That is a spell with weight. I paused my monologue a little too long for the students' comfort. I could feel the tension growing in them. It was actually a ploy of mine. To release that tension, I smiled at the class with sharp amusement. The tension in the air dissipated. And this is why the most powerful magic requires the most elaborate rituals. You cannot ask the universe for something extraordinary with a half-hearted prayer and a supermarket candle. No, the cost must be paid in effort, in faith, and often in sacrifice. A pause, a smirk from my lips. Which is why, ladies and gentlemen, you always hear about virgin's blood in dark magic. Think about it. The harder something is to obtain, the more effort goes into acquiring it. The more effort expended, the greater the belief in its power. The greater the belief... I was now in full thespian orator mode and opened my arms theatrically. The stronger the spell, I announced. Laughter rippled through the hall, though a few students shifted uneasily in their seats. I leaned with my back to the lectern, picking up another marker. So next time you read about some ancient rite requiring a dozen rare herbs harvested under the full moon, a human skull buried at a crossroads, and a dagger blessed by a fallen priest, well, you'll know why. The magic itself isn't in the ingredients. I tapped the pens in my hand, eyes glinting. It's in the belief they create. With that, I waited for other questions. None were forthcoming, so I turned back to the board and began writing again. Bridging the gap. The missing element between quantum and Newtonian physics. Moving back to the subject of the talk. I let silence settle over the room. Then I smiled. A small, knowing expression. Let's discuss this, I said, pointing to the words on a board. The missing element between quantum and Newtonian physics. Why do quantum effects only appear at the smallest scales? Why does Newtonian physics dominate the macroscopic world? What's the missing link between the two? There must be one. I leant forward, my voice dropping slightly to get the attention the following information would warrant. I believe that the answer will not come from physics alone. the missing piece of the puzzle will be found in what we now call the supernatural, the unexplained, the mythical, the things we dismiss because they do not fit into our existing models. But what if they are not separate from science? What if they are simply pieces of the puzzle we have yet to properly examine? Some of you may laugh. Some of you may scoff. Some of you may think this is fantasy. But I tell you now, history has shown us that many impossible things simply needed the right framework to be understood. Once, we all thought the Earth was flat, not just the tinfoil hat brigade. Once, we thought time was absolute. Perhaps one day we will look back and see magic not as a fairy tale, but as the bridge that finally unites the quantum and the classical. I held a dramatic pause and made eye contact with each student in turn. I could feel the incredulity biting at the souls of some of them. Mea culpa to those of you that I have offended with this idea. It's only the opinion of a simple man, I told the audience, my head slightly bowed in apology. If that day comes, the day when magic reveals itself, and it is my opinion that it will, my dear students, I'm convinced of it. Then we'll finally understand that science and magic were never separate to begin with. They were always one and the same. Like Clark Kent and Superman. I paused and drank from the water glass on the lectern from which I was pontificating. I liked the lectern, as it felt like a formal gap between myself and my students. Oh, don't get me wrong, I'm no stuck-up old fuddy-duddy. Well, that's not entirely true, is it? I am. But I always see myself and anyone I speak to utterly on the same level in discussion. As Descartes once told me, even the idiot is a savant of knowledge about something. Do you know what? That quote really loses some of its magic in translation. But I hope you get the gist. After a few sips, I returned the glass to where it had sat. I noticed that its base perfectly fitted into the watermark in the wood stain that had developed there over the decades I'd been visiting. Could this be the very same glass that I'd used here back in the 50s? Maybe. I brought my attention back to the group. No one had moved. Okay, that's a good sign. I open the floor to questions that I will resolutely do my best to butcher, I offered, smiling. A young man in the front, a theologian, I think, from reading the class information files. Yes, Jason. Another little moment of shock on her face, not expecting me to know its name.
Referring back to the concept that faith, belief, creates God, Professor.
A great many things. Not just God, Jason, I reminded him.
Yes. If belief has the power to create gods, does that mean gods only exist as long as people believe in them? And if so, could a god that was once forgotten ever be retrieved by a new belief? Or does their existence fade permanently?
A broad smile spread across my face. Now that, my dear Jason, is a damn good question. And I tell you what, it bloody was. I started, but I had to rethink my thoughts. I raised my eyebrows to the class and smiled. They laughed in appreciation at the action. Bloody hell, Jason. That really is such a damn good question. It's utterly confusticated me for a moment. Another pause for consideration. You see, if we accept the premise that gods and magics are created by belief, then it follows that their existence is directly tied to the minds and the faith of their worshippers and believers, does it not? As long as someone, somewhere, acknowledges them, even in the faintest whisper of an old story, they are, in some form, still present. Another pause, another sip from the glass, and its careful return to the watermark upon the lectern. But once that belief is gone entirely, once the last person to utter their name has turned to dust, then they fade. Not die exactly, but become unreachable, maybe. Dormant, perhaps. I paused, and I shifted gears to something more contemplative. And yet, I glanced around at the bookshelves lining the room. I've seen things brought back. I've seen it. Gods. Spirits. Creatures long forgotten, revived through written words. Old stories rediscovered. Their names spoken again after centuries of silence. Their very existence invoked. So perhaps the real danger to a god isn't just the loss of belief, but the loss of all record. A god may survive the death of its last worshipper if it still lingers somewhere in ink, carved onto stone waiting to be found. Again, I paused in thought. For goodness sake, there are probably lots of old gods and other entities battering around that damned World Wide Web thingy, I pronounced, adding the next sentence somewhat bitterly. In fact, I don't bloody doubt it. I looked back at Jason, nodding approvingly. I offer you congratulations, Jason. Your question cuts right to the heart of it. If belief alone sustains the ethereal, then what happens when they are completely erased, not just from memory, but from very history itself? Can they ever be reborn? Or is that the true death of a deity? That, my learned friend, is something I should very much like to know.
Brought to you in association with Grendel Press. This is Werewolf the Podcast, a serial killer drama.